As many of you know, on January 13th, Taiwan will hold its presidential and legislative elections. The outcome of the election will have major implications for both the people of Taiwan, but also the trajectory of peace and stability with the People's Republic of China, or PRC, and the region for years to come. After 2 terms under Taiwan's current president Tsai Ing-wen of the Democratic Progressive Party, or DPP, the voters of Taiwan will go to the polls to vote for one of 3 candidates: the current Vice President DPP presidential candidate William Lai, Hou Youyi of the KMT Party, and Ko Wen-je from the upstart Taiwan People's Party, or TPP. Since Taiwan has held its first direct election in 1996, it has undergone 3 peaceful transfers of power between KMT and DPP. Now, the country is preparing for its 5th national election to determine the future direction for Taiwan and its people, and a decision on whether to elect the DPP for an unprecedented 3rd consecutive term in power. Until recently, William Lai, the DPP candidate, has been enjoying a healthy lead in the polls, but recent polling suggests he has lost some ground to Hou, and Ko Wen-je is declining even more precipitously than expected. With less than a month left, we could be looking at a fairly tight race between Lai and Hou, with many twists and turns along the way. To help us unpack these issues, we are fortunate to have today with us Dr. Simona Grano, Senior Fellow on Taiwan at the Asia Society Policy Institute's Center for China Analysis. Simona also serves as a Senior Lecturer and Director of the Taiwan Studies Project at the University of Zurich. Simona recently published a paper through CCA called The 2024 Taiwan Elections, a Primer, which provides, a nice overview of each party, its candidates, their ideological positions, and their views on cross-strait ties. Her analysis also examines the attitudes of China and the United States towards Taiwan elections, shedding light on the escalating geopolitical tensions between the 2 global powers. Also joining us today is Rory Daniels, Managing Director of Asia Society Policy Institute and Senior Fellow at CCA. Rory leads strategy and operations for ASPI's projects on security, climate change, and trade throughout Asia. She was also previously the National Committee on American Foreign Policy, where she managed the organization's Track 2 dialogues and research portfolio on Asian security issues, with a particular focus on cross-strait relations. So Simona and Rory, thank you very much for joining us today.
Thank you.
Yes, thanks for having us.
Just a quick note before we get started to our online audience. If you have any questions for our 2 panelists, feel free to submit them in the Q&A box at the bottom of the screen, and I will pose them certain questions to the panelists at the end of the conversation. So with that, Simona, if you don't mind, I'd like to start with you.
Mm-hmm.
Your paper provided a very helpful and very systematic introduction to the Taiwan elections coming up on January 13th. So I'd like to start by asking, now that we've learned the 3 candidates officially, after quite a dramatic buildup over the last month or so, could you kind of give the audience an introduction of who you see these candidates are, what their backgrounds are, what their policy positions are, and kind of what differentiates the 3 as far as their policies for domestic issues and kind of issues that are concerned to the people of Taiwan?
Sure. Let me start then maybe with the DPP and William Lai, whom, as you said, is actually serving as the party's president, but also, of course, as and also as the vice president at the moment, and has been chosen already, I think, back in April 2023. Now, he used to be the former mayor of the city of Tainan, starting from 2010. He's a doctor, just like Ko Wen-je. And as a person, he has a fame of being known for backing Taiwanese independence. However, I have to say that we'll talk about that also later on, more in depth, that he has had to tone down, just like the DPP. His party has had to do the same. He's sort of like more radical positioning, more pro-independence position, because, of course, out out of the need of appealing to both mainstream as well as deep green, meaning those that are more aligned on pro-independence position voters, right? So regardless of his own positions and personal beliefs, I think that should he be elected president, he would have no choice but to follow the moderate line of the current president, Tsai Ing-wen. Regarding foreign policy, he has been very adamant and very sure about the importance of maintaining strong relations with the United States. First and foremost, he has even written an op-ed in the Wall Street Journal about that, and also about expanding ties with other like-minded democracies, and of course in the area, especially Japan. Now, for what concerns, because you asked not cross-strait relations yet, for what concerns economic issues, we know that Taiwan is undergoing a phase of slow economic growth and, of course, stagnant wages on top of a variety of other problems. And on these issues, the DPP actually campaigns on focusing on improving Taiwan's domestic economy through especially expanded social welfare benefits, a higher minimum wage, new local sources of innovation, and here is the main difference with the Kuomintang, a diversification of business and trade links away from China. And of course, also very importantly, it emphasizes that it is important to solve the issue of the skyrocketing prices for housing, including through subsidized housing. And finally, on defense issues, he has taken, which of course are quite important in these elections, Lai has stated that it is crucial to strengthen alliances and of course economic ties with like-minded countries, because that would have a double effect of reining in China's military offenses. And at the same time, it is important to continue to improve Taiwan's own military capabilities. Now, the second party, the other mainstream party, the Kuomintang, has nominated Hou Yu-ih, who is a very interesting candidate for the Blue Camp. He's a former chief of police and was nominated a bit later than Lai in July 2023. He was also a former mayor of New Taipei City, and he has a strong nativist spirit. He's a Taiwanese, which is quite rare for KMT contenders. He's from the south, from the city of Jiayi, and I think that the choice in choosing him was really that the Kuomintang thought that he could play a role in helping the Kuomintang reach beyond its traditional political bastions to areas where traditionally the Green Party, the DPP, actually enjoys higher approval ratings. However, I have to say that has also been part of the problem, because it explains why for a very long time, we'll talk about this more in detail later, but Kuomintang and Hou Yu-ih were actually trailing in the polls until about 2 weeks ago behind both William Lai and Ko Wen-je, because he was not really getting the full blue vote. He was getting about 60%, I would say, of the Kuomintang base, because many people just were not convinced by him not being a mainlander. I mean, for what concerns the economic platform that he's promoting in this campaign, he actually promotes Taiwan's external economic relations, especially with China, as a means of supporting export-led growth. And of course, the party, you can hear very often this refrain being repeated by the Pan Blue Camp, which better relations with China would actually help two things: tone down tensions, but of course also bring back economic prosperity. And in the event of an electoral victory, I think that with the United States, we could see some results of Hou Yu-ih being elected in the sense of being maybe a little bit more of friction with the United States as a result of pressure from the Kuomintang's Deep Blue faction, whose leadership, I believe, would prefer to have good relationship with China over those with the United States. In terms of defense policies, he has argued for a mixture of military deterrence and security policies to discourage mainland China from attacking the island, coupled with renewed dialogue, which, of course, in his opinion, would bring about a de-escalation of tensions. In short, I think he's sort of trying to propose a strategy that pursues peace and dialogue with the PRC without forsaking Taiwan's freedom. And then finally, the third candidate, Ko Wen-je from the Taiwan's People's Party, has actually enjoyed until a couple of weeks ago quite a high support, at least among younger cohorts between 20 and 40 years of age. He founded the Taiwan's People's Party in 2019, which then became the third biggest political force during the 2020 legislative elections. And it's a bit difficult to pinpoint what he stands for, because of course he stands for a new approach to politics. He wants to go beyond, that's what he says all the time, beyond mainstream issues and beyond cross-strait relations to really empower citizens to help them lead better lives, improve their quality of lives. But in practice, he really wants to talk to those who are dissatisfied and frustrated with the two mainstream parties, including, of course, many young people. And of course, has an emphasis to do that in saying that, of course, he wants to go beyond these ideological battles of the other two parties. And this has been, as I said, somewhat popular with the younger electorate. For his own personal background, he's also a doctor like William Lai. He was Taipei City mayor in 2014. And I think it's interesting to say that back then he ran as an independent candidate, but he was supported actually by the DPP. He was then re-elected in 2018 and remained in office until 2022. And for what concerns his strategy, not on cross-strait relations, well, in terms of economic strategy, he has stated that his party will continue to promote trade liberalization and that he actually favors a trade diversification to reduce Taiwan's dependency on China. And in terms of defense policy, he has stated that he's in favor of increasing Taiwan's defense budget to 3% of GDP, which is even higher than the record 2.5% that the current DPP government requested in its 2024 budget proposal. And he has also talked about wanting to increase cybersecurity, air force security, and the country's army and navy should become higher priorities.
That's fantastic. Thank you so much, Soma, for that kind of, hitting the wave tops of the three candidates. And so you touched a little bit on the polling shifts between Lai, Ke, and Ho. But I found it interesting that, how much change has taken place in polling. And, months ago, it seemed to be Lai had a fairly strong lead in the polls and seemed to be, coasting to victory. And then once they registered as candidates, the polls have been changing quite significantly with, it seems to be Ho and Lai getting closer to each other, while Ke, the upstart Ke, is kind of dropping in the polls. Given that there's so much uncertainty and changes between now and the election, what do you make of the recent polling, especially Ke's kind of precipitous fall, and then coupled with Ho's seemingly resurgence and getting closer to Lai? Is that a function of things they've said on the campaign trail? Is it a function of just the ebbs and flows of the two parties as they get closer to the election? Like, what do you make of that?
Well, I think that what you just described, part of the explanation as to why, for example, the Kuomintang, after trailing behind the other two for months at about 21-23%, has now been performing better, could be, but only partially, to the fact that Terry Go, Guo Taimin, has dropped out of the race. And it is also possible, we'll talk about that later, that after the disappointing performance in trying to form a unity ticket, some people were actually quite disappointed by Cowenger especially. But I think actually that it is far more likely that the blue vote has been consolidating around Hoyoi because of several strategic moves made by the Kuomintang and by the Hoyoi camp in the past 2 weeks. And let me briefly talk about that. So first of all, the Kuomintang has released its party list of legislative candidates that are voted in by a vote for parties rather than the district constituencies, right? And top on this list was actually former Kaohsiung mayor and 2020 Kuomintang presidential candidate Han Kuo-yu, right? On top of that, what they did, this was followed with the announcement that the Kuomintang vice presidential candidate would be media personality and Zhao Shaokang, who at the time in the 80s and 90s was actually considered to be one of the golden boys of politics. And now both Han Kuo-yu and Zhao Shaokang are actually deep blue ideologues. They are pro-China deeply, and they hail from 49er families. So, of course, exactly the opposite of moderate Hoyoi. They are both charismatic, they are strong on the campaign trail. They have strong followings of their own, and they are, of course, especially strong among deep blue party faithful. And that consolidates, in my opinion, the fact that the 60% of voters which they were getting before has now probably risen to 80% or something like that. So because, of course, the Kuomintang looked at the numbers and realized that with the choice of Hoyoi, they were not getting the full advantage of the blue base vote. Sorry. After that, they did something else. The Kuomintang, they started to tout plans to revive actually the cross-strait service trade agreement negotiated with China under Ma Ying-jeou, but that was never ratified, if you remember, after protesters first went to the streets and then occupied for 3 weeks the parliament in what became known as the Sunflower Student Movement in 2014, right? So I think that the addition of Zhao Shaokang, Han Guoyu, and plus doubling down on pro-China proposals like this CSSTA, and also talking about opening up Taiwan to more Chinese students and tourists, they may have dispelled doubts about that the blue base may have had against Hoyoi, right? These choices actually are highly popular with the pan-blue base, but I believe they carry risk because they are also highly controversial with more mainstream voters, right? And so the message that the Kuomintang is sending is a bit mixed because, of course, it recompacts the blue vote, but we still have 4 weeks. And according to how China also behaves, these kind of pro-China openings, in my opinion, could turn out to be quite damaging with the mainstream voters.
That's really interesting. Thank you. So just to pick up on one kind of unique development recently in the last few weeks, before they registered, the 3 candidates registered officially, there was this big kind of dramatic press conference that was held between Hoyoi, Terry Go, and Ko Wen-je, and there was, Ma Ying-jeou came in and was kind of swept in to play matchmaker, and you had this this big public spectacle, I would call it, in which we all assumed that they were going to announce a unity ticket, a pan-blue unity ticket, but they did not, and it also kind of devolved, I would say, into some public bickering back and forth, where you had Ko Wen-je's camp and Hoyoi's camp kind of disagreeing over who should come and give a speech, and you had Terry Go kind of fighting for the moderator spot, and it was even for Taiwanese political kind of politics and history, it was quite interesting and dramatic. So, as you saw that unfold, and then now you see the polls, do you see? What do you make of that episode, and do you think that had any impact on the population of Taiwan as far as who they would vote for?
Well, yes, of course. To a certain extent, I think that this failed attempt has left a lot of distrust among the leaders themselves of the 2 parties, Hoyoi and Ko Wen-je, but also among the voters. And I think, because of the strategic moves that we have just described that the Kuomintang has then implemented, they have been able to consolidate voters, whereas the problem with Ko Wen-je now going down in the polls, I think, is really because he came out of this debacle that you just described as a very erratic and undecided person, and he was hurt much more in this sense. Also because he really openly came out and stated that he had, even before this press conference in the couple of days before, he came out and said that he had, been negotiating on his own with the Kuomintang, and next time he won't do that. He made sort of a joke about it because he said he wasn't good at negotiating. But I think that many voters really also started to think, what if next time he does not have to negotiate with the Kuomintang? Read in the background China, right? I mean, that is he fit to lead the country? Does he really have the qualities of a leader, right? I think that really hurt his credibility in that sense. And as I said, I think that they were better. The Kuomintang came out of it better because it was able to recompact the blue vote, right? But I think that one thing we need to note about this failed unity ticket is that to a certain extent, even though it has not gone through, in some cases at the local level, actually these two parties, the Kuomintang and the TPP, are actually teaming up and are presenting one single candidate, for example, Luzhou, outside of Taipei. And that is something that could present a threat because, of course, the current party, the DPP, running again, of course, has been in power since 8 years. And even though it was once the most progressive force, I think many young voters now see them as the establishment, incapable of solving certain issues such as rising housing prices. And so these joint local tickets that we are seeing in some parts of the country between the Kuomintang and the TPP, in one case, for example, the Kuomintang throwing its weight behind the TPP candidates, could actually signify that there is a willingness or an attempt to try and form a bloc between KMT and TPP that could challenge the DPP if it wins anytime it tries to propose, for example, a new law or a budget in the parliament.
Yeah, and speaking of new laws in parliament and policymaking, some analysts have been looking at possible outcomes of the election, and one outcome is the DPP winning the presidential election, the presidency, but losing legislative UN majority. So there'd be a kind of a split power base in the legislative UN where there'd be more, debates and kind of more backlog and more gridlock as far as policymaking. If that's the case, and again, we're sort of speculating, but if the DPP fails to kind of have a majority in the presidency and the legislative UN, what do you think that means for policymaking in Taiwan as far as passing laws and dealing with issues like you mentioned housing, or like with cross-straits issues with the PRC?
I think it's going to be very difficult. I mean, what are the possibilities that we have? We know that the DPP had a majority after the 2020 elections, and out of 113 seats, they now have 61, and they need 57 for a majority. At the moment, they had even more of a comfortable situation because the New Power Party had 3 seats, and it is in the Green camp, right? So the most likely options, you have mentioned a little bit about them, is that we have either an outright blue Kuomintang majority, or that we have a hung parliament, right, with no majority, in which, for example, if the TPP, Cohenger's party, manages to win some 7 or 8 or 9 party seats, it could really sort of like hold the balance of power in any vote, vote that takes place, right? So I think whoever wins the next presidential elections, this we can generalize maybe as a sort of as a general information, whoever will win the next presidential election will probably be a much weaker presidency and government than the one we had in power between 2016 and now. And 2020 and 2024, sorry. But even in comparison to the one we had in power during the Ma Ying-jeou era, so 2008, 2016. And I think that the prospects are what we have mentioned, either that we return to a divided minority government, as we had, for example, between 2000 and 2008. But I think we should note that even if we have this kind of scenario, right, and these elections was actually similar to the one we have today with 3 candidates, the parties have transformed and they are very different now. So for one thing, the DPP has more governing experience than the one it had when it was elected for the first time with Chen Shui-bian in the year 2000. And secondarily speaking, the Kuomintang is not as strong as it used to be back then. So I really do think we need to watch the TPP, because this could really emerge as the decisive swing force or swing party and be critical for governance in any new administration, according to whomever it chooses to side with.
That's fascinating. And just to pick up on the TPP for a second, there have been other upstart kind of new parties in Taiwan that have taken hold and then kind of fallen by the wayside, and you have another one in the TPP and Ke, but Ke seems to have a very, as you mentioned, fairly strong personality. He's got a lot of charisma. But he's also sort of unpredictable. He's kind of he'll say things that sometimes even contradict his own policy positions, and he's a little bit, some call him erratic. And what for kind of a 2-part question. One is what is your just overall take about Ke Ke's impact on the Taiwan elections and on the political situation, his party, the TPP, but also, assuming that he does not win the presidential election, but his party does win some seats in the legislative UN. What role do you see Ke and the TPP playing going forward? Do you think that they're going to be a force to reckon with? Do you think that Ke is going to continue to be, an important actor on the scene, or is he going to, maybe just go off into the sunset and choose to not be engaged in politics for the foreseeable future?
I think it's difficult to say. I mean, it depends really on how many seats the TPP and Coenger, his party, are able to win, which seats also, if it's party seats or not. But I mean, I think it also depends on whom in the end they decide to side with, because at the moment, of course, as I said before, there are some local examples of unity tickets between the Kuomintang and the TPP. But as you pointed out, Lyle, he's actually an erratic person. He was working as an independent candidate with the DPP before. He was elected thanks to the votes of the DPP and the support of the DPP. And because there is some resentment now because of the failed joint unity tickets, I don't think that it is completely out of place to think that in the future he could also go back and throw his weight behind the DPP. So it's very difficult to know. But I mean, because you asked about his future, I think he has all the ingredients to be a second James Soong, right, with the People's First Party, which has become a almost non-existent party. But it's difficult to say because he has had difficult, rough patches in the past in which he had lost visibility, Coenger, and then he bounced back, right? The only thing I'm going to say about this, and then I'm going to give you back the word, is that he has a party that he has established that is really very much focused on his own persona. And from my experience and observation, I think that such parties rarely survive beyond or after the founder, right? And I'm thinking, I was brought up in Italy of Forza Italia and Berlusconi, so it's difficult to say, but yeah.
That's a really important point about the impact of individuals on parties, and once that individual leaves the scene, what's the legacy and staying power of the party. So that's really interesting to keep in mind. Okay, so let me open the conversation to both Rory and Simona about cross-straits issues. Obviously, a lot going on with the PRC and with even between Taiwan and the U.S. Simona, let me start with you, and then I'll open up to Rory for a few questions on her thoughts. We've seen the slogans from even amongst the KMT and DPP that they say the KMT has painted the DPP as a vote for war with China, and the DPP has painted and while a vote for the KMT is, quote, a vote for peace and stability across the strait. You have a lot of I would say pressure being put on between the PRC and the Taiwanese population. I think it's no question about which party and which candidate the PRC wants elected. But the political slogans about the DPP is a vote for DPP is a vote for war with China, and a vote for the KMT is a vote for peace. I mean, if you get beyond kind of those slogans, what differentiates the cross-strait policies of the three parties? And also, if I could, you mentioned Ke's. I think a lot of us are kind of wondering what the TPP and Ke Wenjie's policies is on cross-straits, because as you mentioned, he's kind of at times hewed closer to the blue camp, and then other times kind of hewed closer to the DPP camp. So, I mean, just kind of at a broad level, what are the three cross-straits policies of the three parties and candidates?
Right. So first of all, maybe let me allow to make a general observation. I think that all the candidates at the moment are presenting some variations of the same thing, namely maintaining the status quo, but with very different ideological orientations when it comes to the long game, especially the Kuomintang and the DPP, of course, right? So more of a distance, DPP, or more of a closeness with China. Why do I say this? Because I believe that the situation, in order to capture the mainstream electorate, even even though we know that these two parties have initially had in their party credo unification or independence from China, no one would come out now. That's why these parties have changed completely from the year 2000, for example, under Chen Shui-bian, but also the Kuomintang, and campaign for unification or for independence. That would be political suicide. And at the current moment, it would also be suicide because, of course, you got an existential threat on the other side of the strait, right? So there's been a convergence in the middle of the political spectrum on this. But specifically, because you asked about the candidates, they all have, as I said, different variations of a similar thing. So Lai has emphasized the importance of upholding the island's free and democratic constitutional system. He talked about the fact that the Republic of China and the PRC are not subordinate to each other, and that Taiwan will resist any attempt to undermine its sovereignty. And in July, he proposed the concept of 4 pillars, which are to strengthen national defense, deter resistance, enhance economic security, develop democratic partnerships, and safeguard the status quo across the Taiwan Strait. When it comes to the Kuomintang, ideologically, the party that used to champion unification with China, but has been, as I said, forced to dilute its position in the face of declining support, well, the Kuomintang now favors maintaining the status quo, while at the same time pursuing peaceful relations with the PRC. And Hou Yu-ih has proposed this 3Ds strategy: deterrence, dialogue, and de-escalation when dealing with China. Now, as you said, Koenger, more interesting because, of course, he has less of the ideological baggage of the other two. Well, Koenger said in December now that in the diplomatic sphere, he will follow President Tsai when a current model and relations with the United States under that logic will remain unchanged, but he will be more friendly in cross-strait relations. He has also talked about the military field, in which he talks about wanting to develop Taiwan's self-defense capabilities, and in relations to cross-strait relations and policies, he has talked about several principles of mutual knowledge, mutual understanding, mutual respect, mutual cooperation, to ensure dignity, increase mutual goodwill, promote cross-strait dialogues, and reduce conflicts, right? He also mentioned, just like the other two, deterrence and communication. I think for him, it's much more difficult to really get a grasp on cross-strait relations because, as you said, first of all, he does not have the ideological orientation of the other two parties that were born out of this pro-unification or independence or pro-independence duo. And so we see somewhat of an erratic policy when it comes to cross-strait relations, in my opinion, when it comes to Koenger.
Great, thank you. Rory, you've been very patient. Thanks for joining. You've been following this issue in the elections for a long time now, and just picking up on what Simona said about cross-strait issues, but also kind of just giving you an opportunity to kind of give your reaction to Simona's paper about, some of the key takeaways of this election. Kind of what do you think separates this election from prior elections, and what do you think it symbolizes for the people of Taiwan? And then also, if you wanted to react to some of the topics on cross-strait relations and kind of what differentiates the three candidates, appreciate and interested in your thoughts on any of those questions.
Sure. Thank you so much. And thanks to Simona for writing this excellent paper. I commend it. If you haven't read it, please do go to our website at asiasociety.org and take a read. I think what I'd like to do is just, in answer to your questions, underscore some things that Simona has previously mentioned and talk about, what they mean for governance of cross-strait relations and cross-strait issues going forward. So my key takeaway from the paper really is that the candidates themselves are negotiating and balancing within their own party. On the one hand, they really want, of course, to win this election. That's why they're in this race. And that means that they have to energize the base of their party. And typically, energizing the base of their party drives them to creating policies that conform more with the most radical wings of their party. And as Simona's already mentioned, on the DPP side, that's a very pro-independence wing. And on the KMT side, there are people who are much more friendly towards unification. But the balancing act is that the majority of the Taiwan people support the status quo. And we could have another hour-long discussion on what status quo everyone supports. But from my perspective, the common denominator is Taiwan's autonomy from the PRC. And so how do you kind of manage the most radical wings of the party that want to change the nature of that autonomy or not have it at all in the case of the KMT and unification? How do those different end games kind of relate back to what the candidates are able to present now in the run up to charging up their base and at the same time creating a manageable situation going forward? So I think that, this new inter-party negotiation is really what I'm watching most. It's how, what expectations are created by running slightly to the extremes of both parties for an actual candidate for a presidency moving forward, and how will Beijing react as these candidates kind of continuously drum up their base by going closer toward these extremes. I think, an interesting side piece of analysis from this is that Ko Wen-je's popularity is really about a push from younger people to against this tendency for the two major parties to inch closer to their edges. And so a lot of Ko's popularity comes from running right in the middle, from being centrist. And not only that, but it's the kind of the disgust or distaste for looking at the two parties as enemies of each other and really going towards those extremist positions. I think, from the point of view of Beijing, which maybe we'll talk about in a little bit, they're really watching that type of inter-party balancing and thinking about what it's going to mean for the policies that each candidate might bring forward in an actual presidency.
That's really important. Thank you, Rory. So yeah, just to pick up on a few things that you mentioned there about the factor of Beijing and kind of their pressure on candidates in Taiwan to give an olive branch about the quote unquote one China policy that either is a passing grade, as they said in the past, or not. And I think it's interesting to watch, like if you look at President Tsai Ing-wen's 2016 and 2020 inauguration address, a lot of us were noted that it is fairly progressive as far as, coming up very close to using the term one China policy without actually saying those words. And then, of course, you have Beijing's response, which was dissatisfaction with her framing of cross-race issues and basically freezing relations with the DPP, which is where we're at now and where we have been for the past 8 years. So, given the history of Beijing's, and this is, I'm curious, Rory, your take on this, and also on Simona, the straitjacket, I guess, if you will, that Beijing puts candidates in Taiwan into to either, either repeat the phrase that the magic words of one China policy, and if they fall short of that, even if it's very progressive and trying to accommodate the constraints within the party of the TPP, for example, that it's a black and white situation, and it leads to, if they don't repeat the magic words, more tension and more kind of military coercion by the PRC. So kind of, if you're reading the tea leaves, whoever is going to be elected in Taiwan, what do you think? What is your worries, or are you optimistic that potentially whoever the candidate is could offer a framework that would satisfy Beijing enough to have some sort of de-escalation and kind of warming of ties? Or if, for example, the DPP is elected, we're back to the same situation we've been in for the past 8 years of not having a passing grade and therefore having more kind of freezing of relations and coercion. So, Rory, I'm curious first what you think of some of that.
Yeah, I think each party's victory, let's just take the two major parties, presents a different set of opportunities and challenges for Beijing. A DPP victory is obviously a bigger challenge from Beijing's perspective. So I think that the strategy would be to maintain deterrence against the kind of pro-independence forces, not a huge change. you asked a little bit about whether the DPP could offer a framework that would be acceptable to Beijing. And I think the framework, the magic words are actually a lot less important than changing the independence plank in the party platform. That is a bigger barrier to DPP, CCP, or PRC communications than coming up with a formula that works. And it's really the independence plank in the party platform is the barrier to saying one China. You kind of can't reconcile those two ideas. So it is related. The KMT, however, I think presents a different kind of challenge to Beijing. There's obviously going to be, if the KMT wins, there's kind of a structural change in the nature of the cross-strait relationship because the KMT and the CCP do have a relationship with each other. They are talking, they are in dialogue, but that dialogue also raises expectations for what could be accomplished in cross-strait relations if the KMT were fully in power. So the challenge from, I think, Beijing's perspective, if the KMT wins, is like, how do you make that dialogue productive to Beijing's interests? This is not Ma Ying-jeou's KMT era, right? Even though he's still, I think, kind of deeply involved as a party elder, events have changed and people have moved on. So the idea that there's going to be some sort of snapback to the 2010 era when the two sides of the strait were signing all kinds of economic agreements, I think that's very difficult to predict. It would be difficult for the Taiwan people to swallow. So I think that although there's clearly a preference from Beijing towards a KMT victory, they then have to actually change their Taiwan strategy, and there may be kind of unintended frictions that arise from trying to put pressure on the KMT towards political unification before the people of Taiwan are really ready to have that conversation, if they're ever ready to have that conversation. So for me, it's less about the framework, it's less about the magic words and more about what's possible, what's actually possible given where the majority of the Taiwan electorate is at right now.
That's really interesting. Simona, just kind of your take on this also, Rory's point about the KMT is not the party of Ma Ying-jeou anymore. It's kind of a new KMT, a new candidate. I mean, what's your take on the potential for reconciliation if a KMT is elected versus the DPP, and kind of where we're at in 2024 as far as how Beijing may or may not respond to overtures of cross-straits reconciliation?
Right. Thank you, Lyle. Yeah, I agree with Rory. I mean, I think that the main issue here is that Beijing has refused to talk to Tsai Ing-wen because she did not acknowledge the 92 consensus. She just acknowledged that there was a historical meeting, right, in 92. And I think that was a mistake because now you see actually also editorials in the Global Times speaking about the William Lai as much less of a moderate candidate than Tsai Ing-wen. So they actually know that she, even though they would never admit that, she's a splittist, but for them, but now they realize that actually what may come is probably worse than Tsai Ing-wen, although I think that William Lai will not act on his pro-independence tendency if he has some because of the United States. But I think that Beijing realizes that there's been a discrepancy in the way that they treated the DPP. But you ask what's going to happen if one case the DPP wins or the Kuomintang. I think if the DPP wins, they will be forced or they will feel compelled to signal their displeasure, at least with some kind of maneuvers in January in order to keep face. So they will feel compelled to do that. And their preference, as Rory said, is that the Kuomintang wins. But I think that there's a danger in there because I also agree with you, Rory, that it's not turning back the clock to the times of Ma Ying-jeou. And there is an inherent risk that it could be even more damaging for the stability across the strait, because after a while, Beijing may want to start political talks with Taiwan, right? If the Kuomintang wins. And if the Kuomintang cannot give them much, more than, let's recuperate economic relations, tone down tension. But political talks in this phase of heightened tensions, I don't think it's something they can do because of the electorate. And so that may turn out to be quite dangerous. And I think there's another third option that could play into Beijing's hands, even though I'm sure that's not the preferred option at the moment. And that is that the DPP wins, but it does not have a parliamentary majority, because I think there is where we will see the usual techniques that may work more and better now of China trying to depict the DPP as a corrupt and incompetent government and the democratic system as a failing system. And so, of course, if nothing works and they are not able to pass anything, that may actually, there we may see an increase of misinformation, disinformation campaigns aimed at curtailing and damaging the democratic system in Taiwan led by the DPP.
That's fascinating. So we have about 15 minutes left. I want to open it up to the audience who have been already submitting some questions for you two, Rory and Simona. So I'll start with Garrett van der Wees, who's a deep and seasoned scholar on Taiwan, and he asked about the VP candidates. He asked about. So his question is the choice of Jia Xiaokong as VP candidate in the KMT. He believes is designed to shore up the deep blue base, but his question is, won't it drive away the light blue? And I want to kind of maybe open up the aperture a bit to ask, first of all, how significant is the VP of Taiwan for domestic and foreign policy issues? As you know, in the U.S., that there's a debate about how it's more symbolic and less kind of substantial as far as their power. But the particular the VP candidate of Jia, what is his impact for the blue camp and bringing in voters versus kind of maybe putting off some voters and pushing them to vote for other candidates?
Do you want me to go first, or?
Yes, someone, if you wouldn't mind.
Okay. Well, I think especially Jia Xiaokong, as I said before, yes, there is this risk there. So they recompacted the blue vote by picking him. But I mean, he's a charismatic figure for those, of course, who believe in this kind of ideas. He's strong on the campaign trail. He really represents everything that Hou Youyi, to a certain extent, does not represent. So I think that the question is absolutely right. We may see that they've been able to recompact the blue vote, especially for those who were not convinced by the choice of Hou Youyi, because he represents exactly the opposite, right, of Jia Xiaokong or even Han Guoyu. But in the long run, it may be more detrimental for those who were actually hoping for a more moderate Kuomintang to come, for a Kuomintang that would appeal also to those that are not so hardcore on these pro-unification positions, which does not, in this case, seem to be the case. And even more than that, it may have a detrimental effect on those people that are actually maybe undecided, right? They are more mainstream. And the other, so he asked about only this candidate or all of them, vice presidential candidates.
Well, he asked specifically about the KMT vice.
Okay, right.
Yeah.
May I just offer a couple of thoughts as well? So I think, again, to kind of widen the aperture a bit, the vice presidential candidates really represent the major way that the main candidates are navigating this inter-party bargaining. And the two main candidates both chose VPs that give them what they need to energize the base. I think from the KMT's perspective, Jia Xiaokong gives them the kind of more polished media personality, as well as that deep blue, focal point, so that they can be sure that they're running toward the most energetic part of their base. And for the DPP and William Lai, who really runs more towards the deep green side, I think what Xiao Bi-Kim offers is a really strong connection to the United States. That's certainly something that I think, is a perceived, if not weakness, a perceived weak point of Lai's presidency, is how is he going to manage the relationship with the United States? There is no kind of carving out Taiwan's autonomy in the way that the DPP imagines it, without strong kind of unofficial relations between the U.S. and Taiwan. So Xiao Bi-Kim, who had been the DPP's representative in D.C. as the head of the Taiwan Economic Cultural Representative Office, which is Taiwan's de facto sort of embassy-like entity in DC. She really has those relationships in Washington that will help William Lai kind of overcome that hurdle of, can he do the job of maintaining good relations with the United States? But to get to the first part of your question, how influential is the vice president at all in Taiwan politics? I think it really depends, just like it does in the US, on the relationship between the vice president and the president. And I don't have any special insight into those relationships in terms of these presidential candidates, but I do think that when you see candidates who represent really different pieces of the party, you can kind of assume that their relationship is a little bit also distanced. And so there might be more distance on the KMT side. Whereas because William Lai chose Bi-khim Hsiao, I think, she is an amazing person and politician in her own right. I'm not taking anything away from her own career, which is admirable. But the reason that he chose her was less to, create kind of that spectrum of party views, like a light green and a deep green candidacy, and was more of that functional issue of shoring up relationship with the United States. You can assume actually that they're a little closer on the issues, and therefore she might have a bigger role to play in the governance of Taiwan should the Lai Hsiao ticket, win the election.
Great, thanks, Roy. So got a few different questions that I'll pose to both of you and let you choose which one you would like to answer. The first is on Ukraine. A user asked, have Ukraine's experiences in defending itself from Russian aggression led to lessons for Taiwan in a strategy to deter a possible Chinese invasion? Obviously, Simona, from your vantage point in Europe, I think I would be keen to hear your thoughts on parallels or not between Russia's invasion of Ukraine and a potential aggression against Taiwan. And then we have a second question about disinformation that there's been a lot of talk about the role of the PRC in disinformation, but also disinformation within the parties in Taiwan against each other, trying to distort their positions and sow doubt and discord that certain candidates are hurting or harming the interests of Taiwanese people. Simona, you mentioned housing, which seems to be a key hot button issue in the election this year. So what is your take on the factor of disinformation, both from the PRC? What is your level of worry of this election from the PRC, and also between the candidates themselves? What are you seeing as far as the media landscape of disinformation against the candidates themselves? So maybe we'll start with Ukraine and then over to the disinformation piece.
Okay, I'll be brief because we're almost finishing. But on Ukraine, I think that, of course, there are parallels and there are lessons that Taiwan has taken, right? I mean, first of all, the most obvious parallel of a non-democratic authoritarian country invading a much smaller country. To a certain degree, of course, I understand why everyone goes there, because this could be the second big thing that happens, the second terrible escalation, right, that could be happening in the world. And there are other parallels between, of course, Xi Jinping and Putin, because underscoring, of course, the fact that Ukraine once was part of the Soviet Union and that Taiwan belongs, according to the Chinese perspective, to China, and that, of course, on both sides of the straits, they are a family and so on and so forth. So there are a lot of parallels, but the lessons, of course, are there. There's a lot of anguish and fear, especially shown in the surveys by people that after the Russian invasion of Ukraine started to ask themselves if the Americans have not intervened in Ukraine, and not militarily speaking, but just with, of course, support, logistic and weapons and all of that, will they intervene on the side of Taiwan? I think the situation in this case is very much different, right? So sometimes this also plays into the second question of disinformation. This is also something that China has done, spread the disinformation or the news that the Americans would not stand with the Taiwanese side. I mean, apart from the fact that we may have different opinions, I do believe that for the Americans, Taiwan is of utmost geostrategic, geopolitical importance, also because of the position that it, of course, covers in the first island chain, and that that they would intervene in a military conflict, and it would not be a military conflict with Russia and Ukraine, but the United States and China. This is just my opinion. But I think that there is no interest there. So yes, there are parallels, there are lessons on all sides. China is also studying, of course, what has gone wrong with the non-quick invasion that they thought they would have, the Russians of Ukraine, and how they could do it better. And I think in that sense, it is useful for us to continue to talk about it and remain vigilant. But there are a variety of many more differences in the two situations that I don't have time to go into, because otherwise Rory cannot reply, that we also should be keeping in our minds that it's not the same situation.
Great. So just on Ukraine then, I think that, for me, there are kind of three takeaways for three different audiences. First, the international community. I think what the invasion of Ukraine did was really bring back the idea in the international community that major power land wars that were kind of previously perhaps unthinkable in the 21st century are actually a reality. And we could talk a long time about whether or not that was a blind spot on the part of the U.S., who, of course, our own country has invaded several countries in the 21st century. But nonetheless, I think it's really, woken people up that there might be, kind of like a multipolar world with land wars. So that's a lesson for the international community. I think on Beijing's part, they are learning that Russia made a major miscalculation to think that the West was so divided and weak that it could not respond to this type of invasion. And so they're studying how the sanctions were put together, whether or not there are any protections that the PRC could make on its own economy to kind of hedge against that type of international financial pressure. And then there's the lesson for Taiwan, which is really, I think, maybe the most interesting and grave lesson. And that is that no one expected at the start of the Ukraine invasion for the Ukraine people to kind of organize themselves as a military resistance so quickly and strongly. And there are real questions, I think, about whether or not the Taiwan people would take up that type of mantle to defend their own country and their own political system in the face of real military invasion of Taiwan. So I think those are the three lessons that I see, the entire world kind of learning from Ukraine with regard to Taiwan. And certainly, as the situation in Ukraine plays out, the way in which we learn those lessons or what we do with that information is going to change.
万事不求人，私人助理、私人顾问时代来临了。六度万事，万事相助，超强博士群不断奉献专项服务，信息、财经、健康、文娱、教育、旅游、消费、科技、美食，让您的生活品质全线升级。六度世界现在体验，请去3w.6度.world。
限时免费期间，全体注册网友免费使用付费版的高级功能如下：支持论坛搜索，免费画图。第一步，点击右上角最左边的机器人符号开始对话，像图片中红框中的那样。第二步，如图选择六度万事，我们未来将推出更多的 AI 供大家选择。然后就可以与六博士悄悄畅谈了，还支持论坛内部信息搜索哦。您还可以让六博士做你的助手，帮你绘制漂亮图片。最后可以点击添加好友进来，一起与六博士工作。一起来3w.6度.world尝试吧。